Hello, you're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, and this is episode 2 of a mini-series on Attila the Hun. Now, if you didn't catch episode 1, you can find it anywhere that you stream podcasts. You can find it on Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, and if you prefer the illustrated video version, you can find that on YouTube as well. Now, we're going to pick up where we left off with the Huns menacing Europe, with a threat that perhaps had never before been equaled and wouldn't be seen again until the arrival of the Mongols and Genghis Khan several centuries later. The Huns were terrifying for many reasons. Cranial deformation, incredible speed, and brutal battle tactics among them. But perhaps what stayed in the minds of so many city dwellers in Western and Eastern Europe was the fact that they were so fast, that they could arrive without warning, because their horsemanship was such that they could travel vast distances very quickly and arrive where no one expected them, quickly overwhelming towns, cities, taking what they wanted and leaving. But of course, they didn't just take movable objects and wealth. They had a reputation for killing anything that crossed their path. They made no distinction between armed men and civilians. They had no particular consideration for the elderly, for women, or children. So wherever they went, they cut a bloody swath. And this is the signature that the Huns have left on the books of history. Now, of course, many people were wondering, who were these terrifying horsemen? Where did they come from? Why have they come? And there were all sorts of fantastic myths and rumors about this. One of the most widespread, which was in circulation at the time, was that the Huns were the spawn of witches. So let me explain. The Huns are causing all sorts of fear and trembling across Europe in the 400s. And when people are asking who are these terrifying horsemen and where did they come from, there were all sorts of wild stories in circulation. One of the ones that was being told at the time that the Huns were menacing Europe goes like this. The idea was that the Goths, who were a Proto-Germanic tribe then widely known across Western Europe, the Goths were also nomadic, and they had among them some women who were suspected of being witches. So the king of the Goths cast these women into exile. He said, "Leave us out into the wilderness with you. We never want to see your faces again." And so these witches, having been thrown out of the Gothic society, are then wandering through the wilderness, and there they are found by some demons who copulate with the witches, and the offspring are the Huns. Now, that may seem an unlikely story to you and me, but it's a sign of how otherworldly and how deeply evil the Huns must have seemed to people in Europe at the time, that this was the sort of story being told about where they'd come from. Of course, many of the stories that we have about the Huns are like this, and the problem is they're all told by people who were the enemies of the Huns. The Huns were illiterate, so they didn't leave us any sort of written record of themselves and what they thought of their origins and their customs and why they did the things they did. So our lens on them is somewhat slanted by the fact that it was through the eyes of people terrified of their swords. The Huns emerged from the vast expanse of the plains of the Eurasian steppe, a distance that covered many thousands of miles. And you'll hear a lot more about that in episode 1. But the most well-known Hun is Attila himself, who became the king of that tribe and led them into Europe as far as France and even Italy. And we'll get to that. But where we're going to pick up our story is with a tale from the Roman Empire in the 400s, right about the time that Attila is about to emerge. He hasn't yet. So people know who the Huns are, but no one so far has heard of Attila. And this story begins with an imperial princess. So, the Roman Empire at the time is divided into East and West. In the West, the capital remains Rome, which had been the only capital of the Roman Empire for a long time, but is now simply its western capital. The eastern capital is in Constantinople, and that's also going to show up as our story unfolds today and in subsequent episodes. But in 410, the city of Rome is invaded and looted by the Visigoths, another one of these barbarian tribes that were part of the downfall of the Western Roman Empire. And when the Visigoths invade Rome, they take a whole lot of valuable things, not least among them the Imperial Princess, Galla Placidia. So her brother, Honorius, is the Western Roman Emperor. And when the Visigoths invade the city and they steal this young woman who's only 20 years old, they do it with a mind to using her as a negotiating chip with the emperor a little bit later. So we have your sister, and in exchange, if you'd like to see her again, you're going to give us X, Y, Z. Probably a lot of land and money would have been what they were interested in. The problem was, Honorius, the emperor, wasn't really very interested in getting his sister back. Perhaps the Visigoths' demands were too high, or perhaps he just didn't see his sister as that valuable. So Galla Placidia, at the age of 20, is living amongst this barbarian tribe of Goths, radically different from the highly sophisticated, very literate, very urbane imperial court that she'd been brought up in. Now, fortunately for her, the Goths didn't decide to cut her throat when her brother declined to bargain to get her back. Instead, after about 4 years, Galla Placidia is married to a Visigoth chieftain, a man named Althoff. So she's not doing too badly as hostages and kidnapped victims go, but she has another stroke of really bad luck. Her new husband, the Visigoth Althoff, is assassinated only 1 year after they're married. And the year after that, in 416, the Visigoths unceremoniously return Galla Placidia to Rome, having no further use for her. So in 417, now back in her home city of Rome, Galla Placidia marries a very important military man named Constantius. And not long after they're married, he actually rises in rank to become co-ruler of Rome. So he's not officially the emperor, but almost. The power to shape law and to control what's happening in the Western Roman Empire lies in his hands and the hands of another man. So Galla Placidia is not just home, but she's home and on the rise in a very significant way, because her husband is almost a de facto emperor. They have 2 children. First, a girl named Honoria, and then a boy named Valentinian. And these 2 are going to become very important figures in the story of Attila the Hun. But sadly for Galla Placidia, once again, her husband dies. In this time, it's in the year 425, only 8 years after she married him. And now she's in trouble again, because when Constantius dies, the delicate balance of power between the 2 unofficial co-rulers of the Western Roman Empire has been destroyed. There's a power struggle for who's now going to control the imperial throne by himself. And at this point, Galla Placidia has to flee Rome with her 2 small children and seek shelter from a relative, a cousin actually, the Eastern Roman Emperor in his capital of Constantinople. So she's now on the run and has no assurance that she's actually going to be able to return. Now you have to admire Galla Placidia as an operator, as a political operator here, because marriage in the 400s in the Western Roman Empire, especially amongst aristocratic families, was all about alliances. It was about power. It was about joining fortunes, creating partnerships that would make both families more powerful. And especially for someone born into an imperial family, her fate would have been as a marriage pawn, probably in the hands of her brother, had she not been kidnapped by the Goths. Because Galla Placidia had been kidnapped by the Goths, she wasn't married off as part of an imperial alliance that her brother might have arranged for her. But she did fairly well for herself, managing to marry a powerful Goth, and unfortunately, he's murdered. So managing to return to Rome and once again secure a very powerful marriage for herself, only to watch it collapse yet again, must have been very dispiriting. But Galla Placidia wasn't a woman to give up. When she fled Rome for Constantinople with her 2 children in tow, she was a very determined woman. And it wasn't the last that Rome was going to see of her. But as she's left Rome, there's a civil servant who was not one of either of the co-rulers. He wasn't Constantius, and he wasn't Constantius's partner. He was a mere civil servant, not part of the imperial family at all. His name was John, and he decided to seize this opportunity to try and make himself the emperor of the Western Roman Empire. And he tried to secure his grip on the throne by making alliances with other powerful Romans. Galla Placidia has left to see her cousin in Constantinople, and she's going to come back with an Eastern Imperial army to remove John from the throne and take back what she sees as belonging to her own family. When John gets wind of this, of course, he's desperate to protect his life and hopefully his grip on power. So he sends a very adept young Roman named Attila to go get some help. And who does Attila go get help from? Some of the most terrifying fighters then in circulation. He goes straight to the Huns. And he brings several boxes of gold. And he says, listen, we need some men who are very good at fighting. If you come back to Rome with me and you fight this fight that I have in mind to defend John, then you get this money now and I'll pay you more after the fighting is done. So Attila is also riding hard for Rome with an army of mercenary Huns behind him. So at this point, with John the Usurper on the Western Imperial Throne, there are 2 armies riding hard for Rome. One is coming from the east, from Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Emperor. And this army is riding into Rome to reinstate Galla Placidia and her family with what they believe to be rightfully theirs, the imperial throne. Meanwhile, Attila is coming with an army of Huns, also riding hard in John's defense. By the time the Hunnish army arrives in Rome, John has already been murdered, and the Eastern Imperial troops are there to meet the Huns. 2 or 3 days of very bloody fighting follow, and then Attila, the Roman, makes a calculation. There's nothing further to be gained from this. So he makes peace with the Eastern Imperial troops. The Huns are paid, and they ride back off toward the steppe, to be heard from soon again, as we shall see. But meanwhile, Galla Placidia is now back in Rome, and she's in a better position than she's ever been. So Galla Placidia can't actually be the emperor of Rome, because women weren't allowed to hold that office. It's her child, Valentinian, the younger child, her son, who's recognized as the next legitimate ruler. But he's less than 8 years old, so it's going to be a very long time before he's going to be able to take the reins of power and make the hard decisions that are going to need to be made. So Galla Placidia effectively exercises the power of an emperor without the legitimacy of that title. She operates as regent, so sort of overseeing or ruling until her son Valentinian is old enough to be crowned emperor. It's not going to be very long, though, before the Huns are going to re-enter the story of imperial politics in Rome. In fact, it only takes about 7 years, because in 432, Galla Placidia decides to fire Attila. Now remember, Attila is the guy who led the army of mercenary Huns into Rome that Galla Placidia's troops had to fight in order for her to re-enter the city. So it's very likely that that was something that made a permanent impression on Galla Placidia's memory. But Attila was a very powerful man. He had been operating quite effectively as a Roman general overseeing the legions in Gaul, which had been a troublesome Roman province ever since the time of Julius Caesar, and is still causing problems. So you needed a very effective military leader to maintain order and discipline and Roman control and taxation of that province. And this is what Attila had been doing for some years. He also had very powerful connections. He was able to mobilize Hunnish warriors in a Roman cause. Possibly not the one Galla Placidia would have preferred, but nevertheless, he was very well connected. So, within 7 years of Galla Placidia assuming control, she decides that Aetius needs to be gotten rid of. She fires him from his high-ranking military position. Now, was it because she was bearing him a grudge, or was it because he'd caused some additional trouble? There certainly was a power struggle between him and another very powerful Roman general, which was definitely part of the politics of getting him fired. But Aetius doesn't go quietly. After being rudely unseated from imperial politics, he leaves Rome and heads to the east. He heads back to his old friends, the Huns, the same people who hosted him for several years as a teenager, whose language he speaks, whose battle tactics he knows, and whose reliability he has already tested relatively recently. So this time he comes back seeking their help. So when Aetius is fired by Galla Placidia, who's ruling as regent, unofficial emperor of Rome, he flees Roman territory and into lands controlled by the Huns. The Huns are his old friends. It's been 20 years since he lived with them for several years as a teenage hostage. And you can hear more about that in episode 1, but he lived among them for several years and was fairly well treated as part of a diplomatic trade of high-ranking young men between Huns and Romans. So he spoke their language, he knew their culture, he knew their battle tactics, and he tested their reliability quite recently. But instead of coming with chests of gold, now he comes seeking shelter and help. The Hunnish leader at the time was a man called Ruga, and he welcomed Aetius. Ruga had been quite effective in building the power of the Huns by adding more and more different tribes to the confederacy that became the force we now know as the Huns. They weren't ethnically all the same. What united them was a fearsome ability to fight and very strict loyalty towards their increasingly powerful kings. So this particular king, Ruga, welcomes Aetius, and he agrees to send a small army of Huns back to Rome with Aetius to make sure that he's reinstated to his position. Now, Aetius is in his early 30s at this point, and we don't know for sure if, during this visit to the Huns, he met a young man called Attila. We know that Attila was about 10 years younger than Aetius, so it's entirely possible that they did meet. Attila was in fact related to Ruga, he would have been part of the ruling circle, and he may even have been one of the mercenary warriors who rode back on an adventure to Rome to help their friend Aetius get his job back. Now, I don't know for sure if Attila was part of that war party that rode back to Rome. But if he was, a young man in his 20s, this would have been a good time to take a look around Italy, to take stock of the wealth that was there, of the shape of the landscape, of the fortifications of the cities. And perhaps he saw an opportunity. Perhaps this was where he decided that it wouldn't be the last time he made a trip south. When Aetius arrives in Rome with his band of Hunnish fighting friends, he doesn't just get his job back, he gets a promotion. In fact, Aetius becomes consul, which is sort of the highest of high generals in the Roman military structure. So he returns more powerful than he was before he was fired. He was also made commander-in-chief of the entire Western Imperial Army. A good man for the Huns to know. And it won't be the last time that they interact in ways that shape the course of imperial history. We'll leave Aetius in Rome for the time being, and we'll return with the Huns, who had accomplished their mission, back to their base camp in what is now known as Hungary. Under the leadership of the current Hunnish king, Ruga, the Huns had been able to extract increasing amounts of payment from many surrounding tribes and, indeed, parts of the Eastern and Western Roman Empire. These payments were made in exchange for peace. In other words, People were so afraid of the Hunnish armies showing up that they were willing to make annual payments of gold to keep them from riding in the direction of imperial cities. So the Huns were able to say, okay, you don't want us to show up this summer? That's going to cost you this many £1,000 of gold. And so the payment would be made. And some time would go by. And then the Huns would send another embassy to an imperial court, possibly in the west or in the east, in Constantinople. And they would say, that payment, it's going to have to go up. The Hunnish chieftains are restless. They're anxious for action. I'm having a very hard time holding them back. If you want to ensure that they stay over here as opposed to coming in and raiding your cities, it's going to cost you more this year. And so this game of extortion was already established at the time of Ruga's rule. In 435, Ruga dies, and it's the sons of his older brother, two young men named Attila and Bleda, who inherit a dual kingship of the Hunnish tribal confederacy. Bleda is the older brother, Attila the younger. And anytime you have two men who are going to be sharing control of such a unruly and violent society, you have to imagine that these men themselves had to be fairly fearsome and ambitious, as they were. But they managed to maintain their joint rulership for almost a decade. During this time, they successfully extract peace payments from the Western Roman Empire, headquartered in Rome, and they turn their attention and their raiding parties more towards the Eastern Roman Empire, which is governed by Constantinople. The game that the Huns played at this point with the Eastern Roman Empire would be to return every year, demanding more payment for peace, and also describing grievances that they had, which could also be reasons for increasing the payment. In fact, one of the favorite grievances that Attila and Bleda would use when they sent their embassies was to say, there are Hunnish fugitives, Huns who have fled from Hunnish territory into imperial territory. We know that some of our runaways are in your land, and we want them back. And if you don't send them back, well, we're going to ride in and we're going to destroy your cities and we're going to take them anyway, so you'd better just hand them over, along with anyone else who might have proved troublesome. At one point, they demanded that the empire hand over a bishop. This is not a Hun. This is someone who was an imperial citizen who had proved troublesome to the Huns. So they would make these demands for people as well as for gold. And at one point, there were two Hunnish princes, so probably cousins of Attila and Bleda, who had fled the Hunnish lands into the Eastern Imperial Empire, and Attila and Bleda demanded that they be returned. The emperor complied, and when these two young men were handed over to Attila, he made an example of them that would have been hard for any observer to forget. He had them impaled. Now remember, these are young men, and they're related to him. Attila is not just going to execute them. He's going to do it in a way that was excruciatingly painful and would have left their bodies up as an example for weeks afterwards. I'm just going to say here, before I explain exactly what impaling was and how it was done, that if you've got a queasy stomach and torture and horror is something you would really prefer not to fill your mind with, you might want to skip forward about a minute at this point. Impalement was something that the Huns were quite practiced at, and it involved taking a long stake that was narrowed or sharpened at one end and exceedingly well greased. The victim was then spread-eagled. The stake was carefully inserted into their anus and very slowly and carefully worked up through the torso, through the digestive cavity, through the esophagus, until it was poked through the body at the top right behind the shoulder blade. The objective of the torturers who were performing this maneuver was to get the stake all the way through the victim without puncturing a lung or an artery, so that the person would then be hung like a permanent scarecrow, still alive, still screaming, and then the stake would be gently lowered into the ground and supported, and the victim would be left completely unable to remove themselves to die. It was a horrifying way to go. It would have taken quite a while to get the impalement set up, and it would have taken even longer, days, for the victim to die. And after they had died, the bodies would still be up for months as the crows and the vultures picked the flesh off. It would have been an unforgettable sight for anyone who had seen it performed or anyone who had passed by the body after it had been done. Now, when Attila did this, it was sending a message. It was sending a message that no one was immune from his vengeance, and that disloyalty would be punished in the most horrifying ways, even if you happened to be related to him. It was a lesson that wasn't forgotten by a great many people. Again and again, Attila and Bleda sent their Hunnish embassies to the Eastern Empire and demanded more gold and people back. And the price would be that if the money wasn't handed over, they would raid and destroy towns. In 443, they saw an opportunity. The imperial armies were diverted towards Carthage, fighting another battle there, and seeing an opening, seeing a gap in the defenses, they led one of their infamous lightning raids, one of their very rapid maneuvers into imperial territory. They destroyed cities, they took prisoners, they took slaves, and they destroyed 2 Roman armies, probably by taking them by surprise, before another treaty was reached with the Eastern Emperor. The Huns destroyed 2 imperial armies before reaching another agreement with the Eastern Emperor in exchange for peace, but this time the payments of gold were tripled. So it had been a very successful expedition for the Huns from a monetary point of view. But at some point, the price of peace became too overwhelming, and there was a point at which the Eastern Emperor just stopped paying. And when the expected imperial payment didn't arrive, the entire system of loyalty and reward that bound Hunnish kings to their inner circle and those men to the warriors under them was at risk. It might have been this that triggered a very dramatic change in the power structure of the Hunnish court. Bleda, the older brother, met an unexpectedly early death at the hands of his younger brother. His circle of loyal men were scattered. His wives disappeared, all except for the most high-ranking one, who was allowed to live in her own compound undisturbed. And Attila quickly assumed sole rulership of the entire tribal confederacy. At this point, with all the reins of power in Attila's hands, the Huns became even more menacing than before. They were raiding Eastern Imperial provinces in the Balkans, destroying cities, and by 447, they menaced the imperial capital of Constantinople itself. People inside that city, so old, so wealthy, so powerful, were beginning to be seriously afraid that they might share the fate that Rome had suffered at the hands of the Visigoths some 50 years earlier. They began to fortify the city as they never had before, and they called on none other than Attila to lead a delegation to meet the Huns and ensure that some agreement was reached to prevent them from coming to the gates of Constantinople. Remember, Attila works for the Western Imperial Court. So for the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople to call upon him would have to mean that his reputation preceded him quite significantly, and that they're willing to call in not someone who was a powerful, high-ranking member of the Eastern Court to lead this delegation, but to call someone from the other capital, who had to travel quite a ways to do this. But Attila had a reputation for perhaps knowing the Huns better than anyone else, and having some affinity with them, being able to speak their language, perhaps they thought he had the best chances of securing the deal they so desperately wanted. Attila succeeded, and once again, the Huns were persuaded by a very large deposit of gold to retreat and go back. And once again, The Huns were persuaded by a very large deposit of gold not to attack Constantinople for the time being. So we know some of the things that Attila did. But what was Attila himself, the man, like? We have an eyewitness account, actually. Priscus was a Greek diplomat who traveled in person as part of an embassy to Attila and his court, and he was a very literate man who left us a written record of his impressions of meeting the man. So I'm going to read you a quote. "He was a man born to shake the races of the earth, a terror to all lands, destined I know not how to frighten everyone as terrifying reports spread about him. His gait was haughty, his eyes darting here and there, so that his power and pride was apparent as he moved. Yes, he was a lover of war, but he knew how to restrain himself. He was excellent in counsel, sympathetic to supplicants, gracious to those received into his protection. He was short of stature, broad-chested, with a large head, small eyes, thin beard flecked with gray, snub nose, and the repulsive complexion of his forefathers. His nature was such that he always had great confidence." While he was a man who inspired a great deal of fear, what we learned about Attila is that he was also very calculating about his actions, and that his anger was very often a deliberate weapon that he could turn on and off when he decided that it suited some purpose. But he doesn't seem to be a man who was out of control, a hothead who just did things impulsively and left other people to clean up the mess. No, he was a man very much in control of the emotion that he allowed to be visible to others, and it was usually designed for a very specific purpose. Take the example of a Roman envoy who visited him, bearing the expected diplomatic gifts, which would normally be exchanged after a negotiation. Unfortunately, this envoy, who happened to be an imperial general, wasn't bringing the payment for peace that Attila was expecting. So when he heard this, Attila angrily sent word to the general who was in his camp that he was not going to meet with him, and he could leave the gifts and then leave the camp or be executed. The general, who was not a man easily intimidated, responded to Attila that, "If you want to get the gifts by murdering me, then of course you can do that. But if you want to be given the gifts, you're going to have to negotiate." So he wasn't going to drop the gifts and run away. Attila allowed the general to leave with his gifts and his head intact. So the anger that was being displayed here was more an attempt to simply grab whatever material goods there were and not give anything in exchange. And when that didn't work, he wasn't angry enough to physically punish the man. He let him go. So the anger could be turned on and off as it suited him. Attila also had a reputation for deliberately avoiding finery, and this became more and more obvious as the wealth of the Huns increased with the Roman peace payments regularly coming in. So there were many people amongst the Huns who desired some of the finer consumer goods that they could obtain with imperial gold or that were traded to them. People wanted silk and they wanted gold and they wanted fine metals and jewelry and these sorts of things. And there were people in Attila's court who had them, but the man himself refused to use or wear any of this. So we have eyewitness reports of him holding diplomatic dinners in his house with a long table, and there would be gold plate and gold goblets at the place settings for everybody else. But he himself would sit at the head of the table and drink from a wooden goblet and eat from a wooden plate. And this was a statement as well. It was very deliberate. Perhaps he meant to indicate that he hadn't gone soft. There was a belief amongst the Huns, which has been common to other warrior peoples, that luxury goods and fine living make you go soft. So by deliberately avoiding any appearance of using these things, Attila may have been asserting the fact that he remained true to his warrior roots, and that he personally wasn't attracted by any of these fine luxury materials. Even his throne, the chair that he sat on when he was officially receiving delegations, wasn't an ornate piece of work. It was a wooden chair. Of course, he could have afforded something fancier, but the fact that he refused to use anything fancier was a statement in itself. In fact, Attila and even his older brother Bleda, when they had both been in charge of the Huns, were notorious for meeting Roman delegations when they met outside of their homelands on horseback. This would have been seen as quite rude by diplomatic delegations. The idea would be you would dismount your horses, you would sit down together, you would have some food, you would have some polite words, there might be an exchange of small gifts, and you would reach an agreement. But the fact that these men remained firmly mounted on their horses and ready for action at any time was a statement that they operated differently. That their customs and their traditions were not going to bend to conform with the expectations of imperial delegations. However, Attila wasn't above skillfully using luxury goods and fine living to reward those who were loyal to him. In fact, he regularly sent some of his top-ranking lieutenants on embassies to demand payments from Rome, and to be selected as a Hunnish envoy for this sort of a mission was a special privilege. Because, of course, as a Hunnish envoy to the imperial court, these men would be wined and dined. They would be given the best music and entertainment and food that the imperial court could offer, and many gifts that would be automatically presented to them as members of a delegation. So they would return back to Attila's court happy and with their arms and bags full of booty. So in this way, they weren't just going to demand more payment for the Huns in general, but they were coming back quite personally enriched, and perhaps persuaded that loyalty to Attila was a very rewarding thing indeed. The problem was, this tactic exposed high-ranking Huns to the luxuries of imperial living, and at least on one occasion, this definitely tested their loyalty. The Eastern Roman Emperor, at this point, who rules in Constantinople, is a man named Theodosius, and he is the cousin of the Western Roman Emperor, young Valentinian, who's going to re-enter our story very soon. But it's Theodosius to whom the Huns are a constant headache at this point, forever sending their envoys and requiring more and more payments. So something has to be done about this, because to meet these payments, taxes have to be raised, wealthy families in Constantinople are unhappy, the extortion of cash from the empire continues to increase, and it's a very difficult situation. Now, one of the most important men in Theodosius's court, sort of a right-hand man, was a eunuch named Chrysapius. In case you don't know what a eunuch is, it was a man who was castrated, and they were quite commonly used as officials in Roman imperial courts and in several other imperial courts throughout history, which we won't get into here. But Chrysapius appears to have been, he's described as some people as honey-tongued, but completely corrupt. He's a wheeler-dealer of the first order. He's very interested in extracting whatever he can personally from his position, but he's, for some reason, very much trusted by Theodosius, the emperor. So he's become incredibly powerful, and it falls to him to formulate or propose a lot of imperial strategy. So Chrysapius comes up with a plan for how to deal with Attila. In 449, yet another Hunnish embassy arrives in Constantinople to negotiate peace terms, or the payment that the Huns are going to receive this year in exchange for not invading the imperial capital or other lands. The highest ranking Hun in this embassy is a man named Edeka, and he used to be the chieftain of his own independent tribe before they were absorbed into the Hunnish Confederacy, at which point he became one of Attila's right-hand men, which was a nice position to have. I mean, certainly better than being dead, but it wasn't quite the same as being chieftain of your own tribe. Chrysapius the Eunuch, a cunning man, singles out Edika for special attention. He hosts a fabulous dinner for the Hunnish envoys, and he notices when Edika, who's a steppe warlord, is standing somewhat open-mouthed, looking at the gold-adorned ceilings of the imperial palace. Edika has never seen luxury on this scale. The Huns ride hard and have to do a lot of killing and a lot of difficult work to get the amount of gold that they have. They don't have so much of it that they can use it to paint their ceilings. He's never seen anything like it. Chrysapius the Eunuch, an observant and a cunning man, takes note of Edika's wonder, and then proposes a private dinner between himself and Edika. So on a subsequent night, he gets Edika away from the other Huns, and he has a very intimate dinner. Just Chrysapius, a translator, and Edika, nobody else. And Chrysapius hints to Edika that he too could have rooms with gold ceilings. It would be possible. And then he says to Edika, I want to say something that's going to be to your benefit. I want to make you a proposal that will be very good for you, but you have to promise me first that whether you agree or disagree, you'll never speak to anybody about it. This has to be just between us. This is through a translator. So Edika hears this and warily agrees that he'll keep his mouth shut and he'll hear the proposal. Chrysapius the Eunuch asks Edika a few more questions about his precise relationship with Attila, and finds out that Edika and some of his men have the privilege of being Attila's bodyguard at certain points. Apparently it's a rotating shift. Different groups of men on different days have the privilege of being responsible for the physical security of their king. So Edika is in charge of one of these details of men. And at this point, Chrysapius, after once again getting Edika's agreement to be absolutely secretive about this, proposes that when Edika goes back to the Hunnish camp in Hungary, he should just arrange to have Attila killed. He could do it, after all, if it's just him and his men and only Attila. They could kill him and then return to the imperial court, and Edika can have his own house with rooms of gold and live a life of fabulous luxury. Edika was no doubt shocked, takes a few moments to think about it, and then points out to Chrysapius that this sort of plan is going to require gold up front, because Edika will need to pay off the men under him who work as bodyguards on the night that they are in charge of Attila's safety. So he's going to require a fairly substantial sum of gold to make sure that each one of them are comfortable and assured that this job will be well worth their while. How much gold? Chrysapius wonders aloud. And when Edika names his price, Chrysapius probably has to avoid snickering into his napkin, because the amount of gold it would require to pay off these steppe bodyguards is small change for the imperial eunuch. So he agrees. But there are further problems, Edika says. I can't just take this amount of gold we've agreed on and bring it back with me and the rest of the envoys into Attila's court. He's very meticulous, says Edika. He will want to know everything. He will scrutinize everything we've brought back. How am I going to explain some extra amount of gold? Chrysapius has a solution. He creates an elaborate plan for Edika and the Hunnish envoys to return to Attila, accompanied by a Roman who will bear an official response to the Hunnish envoys' demands. And when that Roman has spoken with Attila, the Roman will return to Constantinople to collect the extra gold that Edika is going to need. And when that single Roman returns again to the Hunnish camp, he will pass the gold to Edika in secret, and then the plan will be set into motion. So far, so good. Edika returns with the Hunnish envoys to Attila. Not a word is spoken for the first day at least, although he must have been incredibly nervous. How serious was Edika about agreeing to Chrysapius's plot? We'll never know. He certainly didn't open his mouth about it the moment he arrived back at camp. In fact, some historians who've taken a look at the evidence suggest that Edika might have been planning to go through with it, but lost his nerve when a messenger from the envoy came in to talk to Attila And perhaps Edika began to worry that that person who'd been on the trip might say something about Edika's behavior that might cause Attila to get suspicious. And remember, Attila is a man who impales family members. What fate is Edika going to suffer if his loyalty is at all questioned? So it seems that at some point Edika loses his nerve. Shortly after the Hunnish embassy returns, Edika takes Attila aside, they have a private conversation, and he confesses everything, hoping in this way to assure Attila of his undying loyalty, that he was never actually planning to go through with this plan. He's come as a loyal soldier to reveal to Attila the terrible machinations of the emperor and his eunuch. Now, even in making this confession, Edika is taking a terrible risk. Will Attila believe him? Will Attila believe in his loyalty? Or will he have him strung up just as an example to others, just to be sure? It's a very difficult decision. If he doesn't say anything and he's found out, horrible death is certain. But even by confessing, he may not be able to save himself. But Edika decides this is the option he's going to take. Fortunately for Edika, Attila believes in his loyalty and decides not to say anything to the Romans just yet. Instead, he sits, deliberately very angry looking, on his wooden chair. He receives the official Roman messenger who had traveled back with Edika and the other Huns, bearing the emperor's response. Attila gives this Roman a very angry reception, and he says something like, "You have a lot of nerve, even coming to my court without the treaty payments that I've demanded." He also says, and we have this from eyewitnesses, I quote, "I would have you impaled and fed to the birds, were it not for the protections granted to ambassadors," unquote. In other words, how dare you even appear before me without bringing the things that I've demanded? Then Attila says, the other Romans who've traveled with the party are going to have to remain with him in the Hunnish camp, effectively hostages, and only one man, Vigilus, the one whom Edika has secretly told him is supposed to go and get the blood money, Vigilus will be allowed to return to Rome bearing Attila's contemptuous response. So far, at least to the Romans, it looks like the plan is more or less going the way it should. Most of the Romans who are stuck now in the Hunnish camp have no idea about Chrysapius' plot and Edika's potential treachery. They just know that they can't go home yet, and they have a very tense time sitting in the Hunnish camp, hoping that when Vigilus returns, Attila is content and will allow them to return home. Vigilus, after delivering Attila's response, picks up the blood money, which is his secret mission, and he prepares to return to Edika's court to hand over this blood money very quietly to Edika. And he's so convinced that everything is going according to plan that in addition to this murder money, he also brings his young son, a child, with him on the journey. Come on, see a bit of the world, see the barbarians, see a political change, why not? So in comes Vigilus, riding back to the Hunnish camp with his son and with a bag of gold that's concealed on his body, around his neck, underneath his heavy coats and his cloaks and so on. Even as Vigilus arrives in the Hunnish camp and requests an audience with Attila to deliver the emperor's response, he has no idea that he's walking into a trap. So Attila grants him an audience. And Vigilus walks in with his young son and this bag of money concealed on his person. And Attila then has him searched. And his men discover the bag of gold that's hanging on a cord around Vigilus's neck. And at this point, Attila demands very coldly, what is the reason for this money? Why are you carrying it? What is it for? And Vigilus, who's been completely caught off guard by this sudden body search and now the incriminating discovery of this gold, is grasping for a story. So he stumbles and he stutters and he tries to come up with an explanation that's going to be convincing and legitimate. At this point, Attila lets loose with one of his legendary rants, and we have his words again copied down from an eyewitness. He says, quote, "Worthless beast! You will escape justice no longer with your tricks. Your excuses cannot save you from punishment. And at this point, he has one of his guards seize Vigilus's young son and hold a knife to the boy's throat. "One word from me," says Attila, "and this child dies right now. Now tell me what this gold is for." At this point, Vigilus is in pieces. He can't bear to see his own son murdered in front of him. Tearfully, he begs, "Please, please, I'll tell you everything. Let the boy go. He's innocent. He doesn't know anything." And Vigilus confesses the whole thing right there in front of Attila. Of course, Attila already knew everything that Vigilus was now tearfully confessing. The entire maneuver was simply to force Vigilus into a public confession. It must have been a very terrifying moment of silence, as Vigilus's sobbing and words ran out, and his son stood there with a knife to his throat, and Vigilus had to wonder what was going to happen next. Maybe Attila let the silence get a little bit long. Before he said, "Vigilus, you will now join the other Roman hostages in my keeping, and your son, this child, will be permitted to ride back to the imperial court with a Hunnish escort. And he is going to bring my message to your emperor." The message Attila sends, in the voice of Vigilus's young son, is that he wants the same amount of money that the emperor was willing to pay for Attila's murder to be sent a second time to ransom Vigilus and the other Roman captives. In addition, Attila points out, through the voice of his messenger, that he, Attila, the barbarian king, has been honorable and straightforward in his dealings, but that the emperor has fallen to this cowardly and disgusting act of a murder plot on his life. The emperor's plot has backfired horribly. He thought that he could spend a reasonably small amount of money to take out Attila and reduce his monetary problems. But now Attila's still alive and angry, and Theodosius is going to have to pay a far, far higher price in tribute payments every year to keep Attila and his men away. After all, if they're willing to make war on the imperial lands because they haven't returned a few Hunnish fugitives, what kind of an excuse have they got now after a plot on Attila's life? The way things have turned out is, of course, exactly the way that Attila would have wanted them to anyway. In our next episode on Attila and the Huns, we will hear about an imperial princess, a marriage proposal, and a military campaign that goes terribly wrong. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss any of the others in this mini-series, and share it with someone else who you think would enjoy it. And if you've got any great ideas for my next mini-series, you can find me on Instagram at Eva Schubert, all one word. Send me a message with your suggestions. I'd love to hear from you.